Hey everybody, welcome in. My name's Nicki Faircloth. I'm a co-director of Women Advance. We're a 501c3 organization located statewide in North Carolina, and we publish content around women's issues. For June and July of this year, we really wanted to put an emphasis on LGBTQIA plus issues. So we hired the amazing Ashley Broadwater to help us facilitate articles and have this panel with our amazing panelists. I'm gonna give you a little bit of background information on Ashley. Ashley is a freelance writer and a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, where she specialized in public relations in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media. A North Carolina native, Ashley is passionate about body positivity, mental health, gender-based violence and response, and LGBTQIA plus issues. In her free time, she enjoys watching Pretty Little Liars, reading, talking to friends, and attending dance classes. You can find her work at her website, www.ashleybroadwater.site. So right now I'm going to hand it over to Ashley so she can let you know about the bios for our three panelists today. We have Allison Scott, Olivia Neal, and Candis Cox. A little bit about the schedule. We will have our three panelists, then we will move into breakout rooms for about 7 minutes. We'll come back, have a review of our breakouts, and then we'll have our Q&A for about 10 or so minutes. So if you could please hold your questions until the end. I'm going to hand it over to Ashley. And Ashley, if you would like to get started.
Yeah, hi everyone. We're going to dive into the panelist talks now, and we encourage you to use the clap button at the bottom. I think it's reactions after each person. So our first panelist is Allison Scott. Allison advocates for the LGBTQ Southerners as the Director of Impact and Innovation for the Campaign for Southern Equality. In 2018, she was chosen by USA Today to represent North Carolina in their 50 Faces of Pride for NC, and she has also been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Associated Press, NBC, the News and Observer, along with other national and statewide media. Along with being a featured speaker for Creative Mornings, she served as a co-chair for the Biden for President North Carolina LGBTQ+ Leadership Council. Allison is a community organizer and bridge builder who has coordinated with school systems, medical practices, churches, businesses, news agencies, and politicians regarding equality for LGBTQ people. Feel free to take it away, Allison.
Thank you. Thanks for having us tonight and inviting me on. It's always a pleasure to be with such amazing people. Several of you I know, actually, so that feels even more like community, which is a really good thing. I think, for me, coming into this year, the biggest thing is, really optimism about 2021, and it wasn't easy to start that way. I don't know if that relates for people, but with the pandemic and everything last year, and seeing the impacts of that in our community, it's been a difficult place for me to get to, quite honestly. So many people were unemployed. We know the pandemic, as all the negative impacts it had, those impacts were doubly felt on the LGBTQ community, who were already struggling with issues of being underemployed or unemployed. And we just saw that continue throughout the year and even into this year. One of the things at CSE we were able to do is grant money to people with emergency assistance grants. And it was a wonderful thing, and I'm very proud of the amount that we were able to do. We were able to fund over 2,500 grants last year alone for emergency assistance grants to people. And it's also heartbreaking because every one of those came with a story and the impacts of what was being felt. And then when coming into this year, I'm a typically a very happy, joyful person. And, but I was having a hard time finding my optimism. I mean, we saw a historic amount of bills filed, anti-LGBTQ bills, specifically anti-trans bills across the United States. At least 12 states in the South introduced bills. 5 of those states have actually passed bills that have went into effect this month in July. And the impact of that on even myself, even though I was extremely privileged to, have employment and have a job and have stable income and housing, it still felt on a lot of people. And I heard that over and over, whether it was a direct impact on you or an indirect impact. The trauma of having these bills introduced affects us all in this community. And so when I look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, coming off of a pandemic, coming off of, historic amount of anti-LGBTQ bills and anti-trans bills, it just opens up all those wounds from early on in my life and throughout my life, and things that I thought maybe I'd healed over, but maybe hadn't healed completely. And it made it hard for me to find optimism when I see the struggle in this world. But I did. I'm finding that optimism because I know while 5 states have passed those bills, there's 7 states that haven't. And that happened through community. It didn't happen by luck. It didn't happen because lawmakers had a sudden change of heart. It happened because of people coming together in our community and fighting these bills and standing up and being seen, being heard, saying this is not going to happen. We're not going to let this happen, and taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other. And it's really through this community that, for me, that optimism, I know that we have the ability to fight oppressive systems and institutions, and that we have the power to liberate ourselves. So that's what this past year and a half has shown me, that our liberation will come from us, just as it always has. We're strong enough to do this. We can do it together. And, I just know that some of the people in this room have also been fighting, some almost our whole lives for that kind of liberation. And we can do it. I know we can. I feel good about it. And I see us working toward that.
Awesome. Thank you. Olivia Neal is our next panelist. Olivia Neal is a queer writer and artist from Greensboro, North Carolina. She graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in 2019 with a degree in English and Women's Gender Studies. She currently serves as a grant writer for Planned Parenthood South Atlantic. Her work has been published by Women Advance, the Orange County Rape Crisis Center, and the Carolina Quarterly. In 2019, thanks to a generous grant from the Bolch family, she completed a creative nonfiction project focusing on historic feminist writers from Chapel Hill. In her free time, she makes and sells zines at local festivals. Her zine series, Crush, focuses on aspects of her own queer history. Whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Ashley. So I really appreciate, Allison, all of the details that you gave about sort of how the pandemic has particularly impacted our communities. And I want to give kind of a personal lens to that. I know we're all tired of thinking and hearing about the pandemic, but I want to talk about kind of something that I experienced and a phenomenon that I noticed over the course of the last couple of years. So on March 12th, 2020, as we were all, I'm sure, remember, North Carolina went into lockdown as Governor Cooper declared a state of emergency. I received an email telling me not to come into the office and that I would be working from home for the foreseeable future, which is still true. That evening, I also went through a breakup with my last partner, who was a cisgender man. And shortly after, just at the beginning of quarantine, and as I was adjusting to the idea of living alone in a 1-bedroom with just my cat, I realized I was a lesbian. So that was a challenging time. It was a scary thought at first. I had identified as bisexual for over a decade. I first began to identify as bi in 7th grade, which to me set me apart from a lot of my peers. I felt like I got an early start. And I was grateful for that because it meant that I didn't really have to experience the early side of being in the closet, being confused, having to understand your identity. But then the joke was on me because I went through that process at 23, which compared to 7th grade felt like a late start. I'd been dating men my whole life. And despite knowing that I was attracted to women and non-binary folks, my romantic experiences with them were limited. So over the course of the pandemic, as I was kind of struggling with that realization and what it meant for my future, I realized that I was not alone. I found that a lot of people were discovering their sexual or gender identity during quarantine and posting about it online. And it even became a meme on TikTok. And I consumed all of that content gratefully because it made me feel seen and heard, and sort of eliminated a lot of the shame that I was feeling over having been wrong about my identity. But I also wondered at the time why so many people were coming to the same conclusion at the same time. Dating opportunities were so limited because of the pandemic. I figured it couldn't be because people were experimenting more, going out more, having new experiences. But since then, I've seen a lot of content creators speculate that it's because we didn't have the external pressure of having to constantly perform our identity to the world. And so without that, we were able to look inward and focus on ourselves. I mean, this extends to so many different facets of life. I know that people who used to believe that they wore makeup just for themselves found themselves not wearing makeup as much at home and started to realize, maybe this isn't for me. That kind of took over a lot of different aspects of people's lives. But I think for many people, including me, this realization was building long before the pandemic hit. But being alone with your thoughts allows you to slow down and focus on what's underneath them. Without the constant cycle of distractions that I had come to expect, I was left with just me. And that gave me the opportunity to explore who I really was. And to me, that means more than just who you're dating, who you love. It's a part of you, and it's there no matter what your interpersonal experiences are. So the pandemic gave a lot of people the time and space to come into their identity. But what next? The paths that usually follow those realizations weren't available. Pride parades were canceled or postponed. Dating was more difficult because of the risk of infection. And there were fewer support groups and club meetups. So I personally struggled a lot with feeling isolated, not just from my friends and my loved ones, but from my community as a whole. And it felt like just as I was learning something new and had this opportunity to explore it, I was being stifled by those limitations. But of course, as we know, the quarantine did not stop those events for long. Pride events took place online. My friends organized Zoom hangouts, and dating apps introduced digital meetups. These events were not just a safe harbor during a really dark and difficult time for many people. They were also more inclusive to disabled, queer, and trans folks who had been left out even before the pandemic. As a person with a chronic illness who often wasn't able to show up to those events because I was having a flare-up, this really was a great opportunity for me. And I noticed how important it was to so many other people. So for me, I joined a Discord group of queer friends from across the country. We organized virtual parties, we watched shows together, we played video games, we shared our feelings about everything that was going on. And I asked them for advice and for their experiences. I also went on virtual dates where we played Animal Crossing together and talked about meeting up safely. And I joined an online support group for survivors to talk about the feelings of isolation and fear that the pandemic brought up. These digital spaces became a lifeline for me, especially as somebody who lives alone with a cat. Now, as many of us are getting vaccinated and feeling more comfortable with in-person events, it's important to remember that not all of us can go back to meeting in person. During the pandemic, accessibility for disabled folks rose to an all-time high, and we have the opportunity to use what we've learned and keep it that way, either by continuing virtual events like we're doing now, combining virtual with in-person events, or making sure that in-person events are in accessible spaces. We can continue to make sure that our disabled queer siblings can join us in our post-pandemic community spaces. We can also keep in mind the lessons about interpersonal health and safety that we've learned. Sharing your health history with a potential partner might feel more comfortable now since we've had practice with communicating about COVID. I know that STIs are more stigmatized, but we should be able to feel the same level of comfort talking about them with our partners. Discussions about getting tested, who you've been spending time with, and what your level of risk is have become more commonplace, and I think that we should really keep that going. At Planned Parenthood, many of our sex educators have observed that talking about COVID safety is pretty similar to what they teach about STI transmission and consent. I hope that we can continue to use these conversation skills to keep ourselves safe from any future infections, including STIs. It's also important to remember that a lot of the language we have around STIs we owe to our queer predecessors during the AIDS epidemic. From them, we learned how to have difficult conversations with our partners and friends for our community's health and safety. Those skills have carried us well through the pandemic, and they'll continue to be important. As I've discovered new facets of my identity over the last year and a half, I've experienced the same isolation and mental health struggles that many queer and trans folks have because of the pandemic. But I've also found new ways to engage with my community, and I've gained so much strength from people who are going through the same thing as me. My hope is that we can take some of the wisdom and resilience that we've learned moving forward, both by continuing to view ourselves outside of the confines of how we're perceived by others, and by ensuring that our community is accessible to everyone. Thanks, Ashley.
Great, thank you. Candis Cox is our last panelist. Candis Cox is an LGBTQ activist, lecturer, model, and TV personality who, in her role as a board member for Equality NC, a leading voice for LGBTQ equality in North Carolina, is the only transgender person to have met with the former North Carolina Governor, Pat McCrory, to advocate against his anti-LGBTQ bathroom bill, HB2. She also sits on the board of the LGBT Democrats of Wake, serving as the first transgender member. In this role, she is working to ensure elected officials are representing and defending the lives and interests of their LGBTQ constituents. In her many roles, she tries to always remain visible, believing that social and political change for LGBTQ people starts with having as many visible representations. It is through this desire to help change the social and political landscape that Candis has appeared with entertainment personalities as well as political personalities. Amongst these are Vice President Joe Biden, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, Joan Jett, Ann and Nancy Wilson, and the band Heart, Kate Blanchett, and many more personalities. We're excited to hear you now, Candis.
Thank you. So one, I was leaving a talk and traffic and all that, so I apologize to you all, but welcome to my office, AKA my car. So, yeah, what has, I can't speak to what the other panelists were talking about in terms of just this past year. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm a Black trans woman, and what I have faced and some of the things that I know my community have faced over this past year are things that they were already dealing with. There's not, the pandemic didn't really highlight a lot of issues. It just exacerbated current ones. But for me, what's been most distressing is the lack of representation of trans people of color. The lack of trans people of color being seen as an authority and as a voice and as a people who have the ability to identify their own needs and, more importantly, serve other communities. So what can I do for cisgendered women, for example, and things of that nature. But also, people have kind of forgotten about the struggles that most people of color face. They want to lump it all into LGBTQIA+, and with all due respect, that's just not fair, because white queer people have white privilege. And it really boils down to race for me. Whenever I talk about LGBTQIA+ issues, I cannot talk about them without putting on that lens of race first. And when you're a minority, you're already starting, at such a disadvantage. And the pandemic really just shone a light on that. You know, when you are a trans woman of color, a vast majority of them do not have privilege because they don't have white privilege. And we know that they face unemployment, and a lot of them have to engage in survival sex work. The pandemic didn't change that. And if anything, it made that harder, and it made access to resources even harder, because you had to, you couldn't go in person, you couldn't, you know, mingle with people to find out what opportunities are out there. You had to have a smartphone and the internet connection and a laptop and be able to Zoom. And when you don't have stable and safe housing, and you have to engage in survival sex work, you don't have those resources. And I think it's imperative that people understand that I've met a lot of people who find themselves in those situations. They don't have, I'm sorry. They don't have the ability to engage in survival sex work such to the point that they can actually take a breath. A lot of them are living in motels where they have to pay by the day. So they're up first thing in the morning, and they're spending a vast majority of their day just trying to pay to stay that evening. And yeah, you know, it's just, it's not easy for them. And I think that we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing? What are we doing to actually help them? And I always challenge people to say, in whatever position you find yourself, whatever role, whatever it is that you're doing, if it is in any remote professional capacity, what are you doing to actually enrich the lives and engage with trans people of color? And that's, for me, something that is so imperative. It's great to talk about allies. I've got a ton of allies. It's really hard when my allies are getting paid for work that I'm more qualified to be doing. It's really hard when my allies are enjoying the wealth that comes along with their privilege, and they highlight their struggles. And I'm like, I'm Black. I'm a Black trans woman in the South. I'm like, I'm one generation out from Jim Crow laws. 3 generations ago, and my family were slaves. Four generations ago. I'm like, yeah, my struggles, I don't care. I don't care if you don't use the right pronouns. Most Black people who are queer don't have the luxuries of exploring their gender identity and gender expression and sexuality, because that's something that comes along with time, and time is something that comes along with wealth and privilege. So just understand that we don't all face the same things. We all have very different experiences, and a lot of it is influenced by our race. And by a lot, I mean nearly all of it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very deep. Thank you so much for speaking out on those things.
We got to go back.
Well, let's talk about it. Does anyone want to share what they talked about in the breakout room?
Candace, go ahead. I want to hear you. I mean, you come in here talking about it. You're leaving me hanging on the edge here.
Okay, well, I mean, you know, hey. So ours was really exciting and unique because we were the only ones there, and we're both of color. So we talked about what it means to be an ally within your own marginalized community. And to me, like, we were getting good because I was like thinking about how that really speaks to so many situations. You know, how can I be an ally within my own marginalized community? And what does that look like? So like, is a white trans woman an ally of a Black trans woman? Because being Black, she's already, you know, down and everything. And we talked about the power of, you know, the individual and the power of that voice. Well, I talked about, and some of the unique things that Blacks face. And it just really drove home what I was talking about, that there is a lot of differences between experiences, no matter what, based upon your race. And then talking about what is the impetus for that for Black people? How do we cure that? And it's like, well, Black Americans exist because of one thing and one thing only: slavery. Whites can trace their presence here back to any number of things. Their families came here as immigrants, you know, in the 19th century, or they were part of the founding fathers, or any number of things. But if you're Black, you are here unless you are of close African ancestry. You're here because of slavery. And so our culture is still defined to this day by slavery.
That's deep. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I appreciate so much for having this. I have to go now though, but I appreciate everyone being here and all your insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Would anyone else like to share what they spoke about? Ashley, did you come off being muted?
Yeah, we talked a lot about what accessibility looks like, because it can look different for different people and different groups. And so it's just important to like give people options, because some feel more comfortable in person, some feel more comfortable virtually. Yeah, that was one of our main points.
You know, and another thing we're talking about, and it's Takira, it goes to your question right there. We just got into the end of it. Like I said, I hate to keep talking about like grant making, but it was like this, to me, it's like this just wealth of knowledge. When we were giving out grants at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, but also at CSE for many years now, is what you see. It goes to a piece Candis was talking about, of how, especially like Black trans women and, you know, Black people in our LGBTQ community and Hispanic people in our LGBTQ community, when we get all the people in there and we start getting into other than white, we see that those people find themselves at the front of the line and have access to the applications because they have better phones, they have better internet, they even have internet, you know, all these kind of things. So one of the things I talked about there was what we found was, by slowing a process down, you can help to take away some of that privilege of access. And slowing it down can mean a lot of things, like, you know, like you were saying, you know, like longer application time. It's not always feasible with a lot of things. When I say slowing it down, I mean even the design phase. You know, we're in a capitalistic country, and we are pressed to go like really quickly. And when you do that, you lose sight of humanity, and you lose sight of minorities, and you lose sight of all the things that people are going through. So slowing the design process down of anything you're doing. Also, like when you open up a grant round, you know, reaching out to people ahead of time, like impacted communities. So reaching out to, you know, not just trans people, but, you know, specifically like trans people of color, whether it's Black and Hispanic, and all the different options that, you know, or not options, all the different facets of people that there are. But slowing that whole process down, because then you're taking into account the privileges that some people have, and you're kind of like okay, you're not going to start at the head of the line this time. You're going to start behind, and we're going to intentionally slow this process down and move other people up to the front of the line to give them access to overcome the barriers they're facing, whether it be technology, economics, or whatever is going on for them. And it's really powerful to not look at it through a race, not like our race, but like a capitalistic race to get things done and accomplish things really fast. And the winner, whoever gets there first wins. And when you start looking at it differently, it's amazing how it can change the outcome. It's part of how, like our grants, over 50% of the people who receive grants were people of color. And that's the demographics of that are unbelievable. Over 70% of the people were people other than cisgender. It really makes a huge difference just to simply slow it down some. I mean, you can give it out quick, but you can slow other parts of it down. And I think that applies across the board. I mean, it's not just for grants, it's for all kinds of things.
Yeah, and if anyone else has questions, you can feel free to shout them out or put them in the chat.
I have a question. So I think we get this a lot, and myself as an ally, I'm just not sure. What do y'all think about terminology? Like, I heard Candis when she said it's not all LGBTQIA+. Can anyone speak to me about like preferences in terms of like terminology and things? Does that make sense? Because sometimes I just like am not sure.
You mean pronouns? Is that what you're talking about?
I guess
Or
maybe,
or like labels, like do you identify as?
like
I mean,
if I was gonna go ahead.
Oh no, I was like, I can say for me personally, I don't care as much. I care more about the intent. And yeah, like for me, it's kind of like, why are you talking about it? Like, and I always tell that to allies, like, that should be the question. It's like, why do you need to know what I identify as? Like, do you know, if you know my name, everyone has a name, and things like that. I feel like everything else tries to like remove the person from everything. And I tend to be someone who gives people the benefit of the doubt. But I'm like, I get it. Like, you just met me, and it's like trans woman of color. And if that's not something that exists in your nomenclature, then it's just not going to feel natural. But if I can tell that the intent is for you to show respect, I respond positively. If it is like some kind of freak show curiosity like thing, I can sense that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone else, but most LGBTQIA+ people have a really good sixth sense about others' intent.
That's such a great point, Candis. I feel like, I studied language and culture at NYU and then at UNC, and so much of it is about like, understanding the history behind those words. But at the end of the day, I think like exactly what you said, intent matters so much more in a lot of circumstances where, like I've heard a lot of my non-binary friends say, I know the difference between somebody who is using my pronouns because they've learned to do that, but don't actually see me that way, and somebody who is slipping up occasionally, but I know actually sees me the way that I want to be seen. And those things can coexist. I think like language, like we were talking about in our breakout room, like language is complicated and it takes time for it to evolve, and it has history that is difficult to learn, but like people within the community have different words for themselves and each other. And I think as long as you communicate what you are comfortable with, and then that's all you can really do.
I agree. I think pronouns are weird anyway. I mean, I don't know, like being trans and just on my journey, I know how I felt early on, and I know, it's like I said, I'm speaking for me. it was very different. Like, you know, if I felt more vulnerable and pronouns meant more, and now I just don't care anymore about pronouns, because it kind of goes like what you were just saying, Candace. It was, for me, it's about intent. And I don't really care what pronouns you use as long as you're not weaponizing them. That's what matters, is the intent of it, and if it's weaponized or not.
And you bring up a really good point, Allison. About, like, you talked about early on in your journey, it meant more, and I think that's something for allies to be very aware of. That I will go so far as to say that's kind of universal. Where people are in their personal journey is going to very heavily influence what they need. You know, most queer people, when they first come to terms with their own, you know, selves, they feel very, very vulnerable and raw. And for trans people, that really drives home if our external appearance is not where we want it to be for who we are and what we are. So for me, the more I saw myself as my former gender, the more sensitive I was to being referred to by that gender. And now I am at a point in my transition where I'm like, honey, I look good. Like, I actually, like, I make money to, like, you know, dress up like a woman, or, you know what I mean? And I'm older. I'm a lot older, and I've dealt with more things in life on my journey. And yeah, because I mean, LGBTQIA plus people, I always tell people, I'm like, I had two births. I was born from my mother, and then I had my birth when I had my realization, because I went through all of life's, you know, phases in like a matter of like a year. It's like I was a teenager, I was all of those things. So I'm sorry, I'm long-winded too.
No, I think that was great to understand and hear your perspective, and you know what it's like in the process and coming to the realization and all that good stuff. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I'll hand it back to you, Ashley, in case if anyone has any questions for each other, or any final words or statements for each other, or anything you'd like to share. We have 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we're going to close out.
I'll say, it was so good to see you, Allison. Like, I don't know if that's allowed, but I'm like, you look so good, and it's so good to see you. And it's been so long.
I know. It's been too long. It's always good to see you. I was telling somebody today, they're like, what have you got tonight? And I was like, I get to be on a panel with Candis again. Yeah, it's good to see you. And it's just so real. I'm like, I just want to like me and you need to talk, because it's so funny when I hear you speak, and I'm like, oh, some of this stuff sounds like it's coming out of my head. And you know, just hearing, you know, it's a difference when you're trans, when you're early and later trans. You know, it's just so funny how things change and the perspective. And you know, and that's what I tell allies. I'm like, you know, when people say this bothers them, I don't care what it is, if it's a pronoun, if it's a name, or if it's a term or whatever, you know, just listen to them. Just listen, because you know, that's how I am now. I'm like, I don't care anymore. I'm at that point in my life, and I'm like, you think you can bother me? I've had people spit in my face, literally spit in my face. You think calling me the wrong pronoun is going to bother me at this point in my life? Please.
Right. I'm like, look, I've got, you know, an elderly relative that I take care of, got a disabled person that I take care of. I meet with some of the most, you know, just like asinine, like grotesque people for a living. Um, I'm like, I have dealt with so much stuff in my life now that I'm like, oh, you called me he, or you called me by my previous name. Oh my gosh, no. Is my mortgage going to still get paid? Is my family still okay? I'm like, yes. So great. And you calling me by whatever literally changes nothing about me as a person. I'm like, I have the receipts for how I got to where I'm at now. And I now know that I have the power to just be who I am. And nobody calling me something or seeing me as something changes who I am. But when I was young, oh, you couldn't tell me that. And I think that's just kind of true for all young people, and not just young in years, but young in their journey.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just say, as someone who's newer on my transitioning journey, it's really helpful to hear this perspective from people who have been doing this longer. So I'll try not to let things bother me so much.
No.
No.
And you know what? It's
It should bother you.
okay.
Yeah.
It's okay because
Yeah.
it's a part of your journey. It's
That's right.
and things that mattered to me then don't now. That's kind of true of life.
Mhm.
So don't apologize. It's like things that bothered me, you know, things that I thought mattered the most when I was young don't really matter now. So no, meet people where they're at. And I appreciate Allison for saying that, because that is spot on.
This has been an awesome discussion. I really appreciate our panelists and everyone who came and attended. So thank you again. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank y'all.
Thanks, y'all. This has
Appreciate
been
it.
great.
Yeah, we'll have a recording. Take care, everyone.